Great.
Okay. So, suicide has always been a genuine evolutionary puzzle. How can evolution explain the willingness to make costly sacrifices for the group, like committing a suicide attack or fighting to the death?
Well, first of all, evolution doesn't have to explain all of human behavior. I mean, evolution doesn't explain pornography, why people are all hot and bothered about pixels on a screen. Evolution just provides things that are adaptive, but they can take on their own cultural life irrespective, regardless of any adaptive measure. Suicide can be encouraged in families or in societies where the people are not particularly productive, or where the problems, the solutions that the person has can only lead to disharmony. Or it can be used as a costly signaling mechanism of commitment and true belief, which can allow the group to survive where the individual dies. But for that, you also need a sort of kin psychology, a fictive kinship, a belief that the group is like your family. And just like a mother or father who sacrifice their lives for their children so that their genes can survive, so people can sacrifice for their group so that their group ideas will survive.
All right. What it means to act like a devoted actor and what we know about value-driven behavior.
Well, devoted actors, unlike rational actors, are willing to act, to behave independent of risks and rewards or costs and consequences. We know not very much about, especially in our particular shopping mall world and rational actor academic settings, where sort of utilitarian mindset is predominant. But we're beginning to understand how devoted actors violate some of the basic axioms of standard economic and political theory based upon utilitarian precepts. For example, devoted actors wouldn't trade off their values for all the money in China. In standard economic theory, everything is fungible. That means you can find a way to change anything for everything. Of course, people wouldn't sell out their country or sell their children for anything. It's immune to or resistant to temporal and spatial discounting. Again, in economic and political theory, things that are in the here and now are more important than things that are far away. There's that expression, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. But when it comes to sacred values, values that drive devoted actors, distant spaces and distant times may be much more important. For example, Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina, the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, Christ's crucifixion, the second coming. These can all be much more important than what happens today or tomorrow, especially for those people who believe. And if you believe that your brothers or sisters, even your ideological brothers and sisters, are under attack, even though you've never seen them, even though they live thousands of miles away, for example, like Muslim fighters in Sulawesi who were cannibals 3 generations ago, separated by 55,000 years of human evolution, they're willing to go and die in Afghanistan and Palestine and Iraq. Why? Because they believe in the same values.
Okay. From your experience as a field researcher on extremist groups on the front lines of battle, what can you tell about how and why people become radicalized?
Well, we can't tell much about how people become radicalized from our work on the front line. That's another story. That I also have a story for. But what we find on the front line is why people are willing to fight and die, which is a different problem. So, President Obama, for example, in September 2014, echoing his national intelligence director, said the biggest mistake we did in Iraq was underestimating the ability to fight of the Islamic State and overestimating that of the Iraqi army, because will to fight is imponderable. That is, you can't gouge it, you can't estimate it. And so what we do on the front line is try to figure out if, in fact, it is ponderable, if you can predict will to fight. And we find that the reason that it was seemingly unpredictable is that almost all theories, whether in psychology or military sociology, relied on standard utilitarian theories based on firepower and manpower and ordnance, and we were able to find that people driven by values they truly believe in would make them sacrifice the last measure of devotion, even their families.
And what about the story how
People
get
radicalized?
radicalized?
Well, people get radicalized for all sorts of reasons. I mean, the people who radicalize into violent extremist groups span the normal distribution generally. The biggest predictor is who their friends are. If their friends get radicalized, they're much more likely to get radicalized. And we find also that it's mostly young people in transitional stages in their lives. They've just left their traditional family, students, immigrants, having left a boyfriend or a girlfriend, looking for a job. They're looking for a new sense of identity, and especially if on their margins today, where their frustrations haven't, their aspirations haven't been realized, then they're much more susceptible to enlistment in these groups.
So what findings would you highlight from your post-ISIS Mosul study? Specifically?
Well, that the Islamic State may have lost the caliphate, but not necessarily the allegiance to its core values among young men coming out from under their rule. Most of the young men, in fact, most of the population in the Sunni heartland, the Sunni Arab heartland of Iraq and Syria, supported ISIS as al-Thawra, the revolution. They were disappointed in the end, some because they thought ISIS was particularly brutal, intrinsically brutal. Others thought that ISIS became brutal because they were forced by the coalition nations against them. Much the same debate happened with the French Revolution, for example, and that they had to institute terror, just as Robespierre did, to preserve their revolution. And although most of the people who were formerly under ISIS will reject the brutality and the cruelty and the killings, they do believe very strongly that Sharia, which was the core value, governance by Sharia, is the only way that their societies can be free from corruption and thrive. And they're almost to a person against democracy, because their experience with democracy is the other group got the right to vote as well. Since they're the majority, now they rule, and because there are no liberal institutions like the 200 years of institutions that developed in Europe, free press, opposition parliaments, things like that, democracy only breeds a tyranny of the majority, and that they reject also.
One last question. What's the role of the social sciences and of research-based approaches in countering violent extremism?
Well, from a policy point of view, it's fairly complex because policymakers are not interested in truth. I mean, truth is secondary. They're interested in persuasion and victory. Truth can help in arguments for persuasion and victory. When it's a truly existential crisis, like it was in World War II, when truth really is important, then social science can provide the direct means for military or policymakers, politicians, to make decisions. When it's not a direct existential threat, and terrorism isn't. You're much more likely to be killed by a lawnmower going crazy than by a terrorist incident in the long run. It's mostly the media that has made it the oxygen. It's the oxygen that keeps it going. All social science can do is help people understand what's going on, what's probably false and what may be right. And politicians can use it as they see fit. I mean, one of the mistakes of academics, social scientists, especially in this kind of thing, is when they do find information that's interesting and true, they tell the politicians, this is what you have to do, and the politician goes, who elected you? I mean, who said we're the representatives of the people? So even though the information is very important that social science can provide, in terms of what's really happening in the world instead of fake news, social science still has a very, very big problem in communicating with policymakers. So that you have to, as Mandela said, you have to lead the truth from behind. You have to present the evidence in a way so the policymakers themselves make the decisions, or believe they're making the decisions. And that we don't see yet, which is why, for example, in the United States, There was a paper written in the National Review, which was an important publication by two young men who had gone to Ivy League colleges, Yale and Columbia, who had senior roles in the administration. One was head of counterterrorism for the Defense Department, another was the Middle East guy in the National Security Council at the White House, and they wrote a paper, Why Academia is Irrelevant to Decisions. Academia is also very much, I'm going off track here, but academia is also very much, especially in the United States and probably here as well, or in France as well, very leery since the Vietnam War of getting involved with power. Power corrupts. And so they want to be completely independent. The problem is only criticizing power doesn't help at all. It widens the gap between the people who rule and need information and the people who have the information. And how you narrow that gap is a very, very difficult problem. And although I understand it, I find the position of most academics with respect to that unethical, because what it says is, we don't like you, you're in power, we don't like the power, which may be true. Maybe they may be corrupt, to a large extent are. But if you don't do anything about it, if you don't engage, then you just let the corruption continue and bad policies, and that's what we see. I mean, are we any better off? I mean, 9/11 cost the bad guys, Al-Qaeda, $400,000 to $500,000. The United States has spent over $5 trillion. That is 10 million to 1 advantage, and we're worse off than before. So something's not right.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.